Okay, we're going to hear now from Paul Jones, the EMEA lead for Population Genomics at Illumina. Paul is a former colleague of mine. I'm a broadcaster, but a science broadcaster, but I also am head of public engagement for the 100,000 Genomes project in the UK, and Paul was the commercial lead at the 100,000 Genomes project. And you're also going to lay out some of the challenges for us.
I am, Viv. Thank you very much for the introduction. Delighted to be here. Good morning, everybody. The theme that I'm going to address in the next 10 minutes or so is this idea of technology convergence and this idea of capitalizing on the opportunity. But I'm actually going to take a genomics perspective on it. And I'm going to talk about technology convergence, but I'm also going to address I think the opportunity that's broader than just technology convergence, the convergence between different sectors, different mindsets, different cultures, different spheres of influence that I think are also converging and creating some fascinating dynamics around this principle, not just of accelerating innovation, but accelerating the adoption of innovation, which I think is a critical aspect of just not coming up with the great ideas, but actually translating them into practice, and in the sphere that we're working in, applying them into healthcare systems and making a difference to patients. So really, what has technology convergence meant in genomics? How has it manifested itself? What does it look like today? What strategies are in place to capitalize it on, and indeed, where do I see it going next? I've got just 9 minutes left. I know Viv is going to keep me to time, so I'll try to be short and punchy, but I'd welcome some questions at the end of the session. And it's actually picking up on this theme that you addressed just at the very end of your discussion, Annette, previously, cost. And one of the things that's happened in the space that I'm focused on is a dramatic reduction in that cost. As a result of convergence, in this case, a convergence around chemistry, optics, software and hardware, that has fundamentally transformed over a period of 15 years something that took a multi-billion-dollar global endeavor to sequence the first genome, to the idea today that we can actually sequence a genome for under $1,000 and probably do multiple genomes, if not per hour, at least per day. And we're striving to capitalize on that convergence and that dramatic reduction in cost, which opens up this wonderful idea, and it's not my idea. I've adopted it, taken it from a great book by Stephen Johnson that talks about this principle of where great ideas come from, where do good ideas come from. And he talks about this principle of adjacent possibles. When you have a world where all of a sudden the front door is opened because the cost and the turnaround time has so dramatically accelerated, it opens up a range of potential opportunities associated with that. He describes them as being adjacent possibles. And I think that's a lovely idea to start thinking about as part of this convergence theme. And when you look at it from a genomics perspective, that dramatic reduction has resulted in enormous innovation around everything from the microbiome research, the opening up of the consumer genomics agenda that just simply would not have been possible without that kind of transformation, the application into the therapeutics agenda. 42% of all drugs, 73% in oncology now, have the potential to be described as personalized medicines based on, I would argue, the trigger that has been enabled by the revolution in genomics. The principal huge research endeavors that I'm sure will be translated in the future into clinical practice around gene editing, the huge potential around liquid biopsy, and the particular area of focus that I'm going to spend the next few minutes on, talking around the application in large-scale endeavors like the 100,000 Genomes project, which was a great example of, based on that previous slide, how this becomes possible around this theme that we describe as population genomics. So all of those worlds, to varying degrees today clinically applicable, but I sense that all of them in the future could have relevance to patient care, and all enabled based on the transformation and the reduction in the cost associated with the genomics agenda. So I'm going to pick up on that theme, as I say, of that last topic, the population genomics piece. What do we mean by that? Well, it's this principle, and many of the same themes that Annette was talking on there, is multiple stakeholders at the same table. embedded in a healthcare system with full and ongoing patient support and engagement, looking to drive at what we call a learning health and care system that learns from the process of applying something clinically that also opens up a research agenda. And that's one of the things I'd like to pick up on. It's not just about technology convergence, but it's also a convergence of mindset. And when you look at these two fundamentally different worlds around research and around clinical utility, I believe there is a huge potential to encourage those worlds to start to converge too, to bring them closer together. They may have fundamentally different objectives, but if we can connect them and accelerate the connection with the two and facilitate the speed with which things that exist in the research world can get translated into clinical application, and then through clinical application, they inform future research endeavors, I think there's huge value to be unlocked from that principle of convergence. And so the theme around the patient at the center, the creation of an accessible, integrated data set is core to this. And the other key theme is having multiple stakeholders at the same table, even if they have fundamentally different objectives, facilitating the connection between them and having them all there, whether it be patient groups, patient organizations, patient at the center, whether it be an industry interface, whether it be the academic research endeavor that's so critical to unlocking the future potential of this whole arena, or the clinical application, all of which are absolutely key to make this a reality. And we talk about this principle of an eternal loop. You know, on the left-hand side, you've got the clinical care paradigm, which has traditionally been separate and distinct from the research paradigm. And we're trying to challenge the status quo, connect the two worlds, and accelerate the link between the two. And that convergence theme, I think, is another one that has huge power to have relevance to day-to-day practice from whichever perspective you come from in this world. The 100,000 Genomes project, which I worked very closely with Viv over a number of years on, for me was a great example of trying to do this at scale. I think one of the criticisms, I think even one of the questions I saw that came up already was, it's great having pilots, but how do you translate these into something that make a difference at a national or a large scale level? And I think there are examples now, particularly in this genomic space, and I think the 100,000 Genomes is an exemplar around the world of an initiative that is well beyond being piloted. It's actually now at the point of being translated into something that's being commissioned at a national level by the NHS in England. And if you like, the pilot has proven its value and is now being translated into standard of care and day-to-day practice. That is a huge achievement in a system that I sense would have, if you'd asked me 5 years ago whether that was possible, I would have said that's a damn near impossible task. And 5 years later, it's been proven that it is possible to facilitate that translation. The key question is, what learnings come from that could be relevant elsewhere in the world to facilitate that acceleration? And again, the key themes for me really come to the fore around multiple stakeholders at the same table, all of whom have different agendas, but you need to, and Genomics England have played a fantastic role in facilitating the link between those different stakeholders. There is a live interface into the healthcare system. Patients are consented from the live healthcare system. Feedback goes back to those patients in order to advise them on diagnoses and potential treatment options. This is not a small-scale pilot. This is having a fundamental impact on the whole of the NHS and the potential for translating this into value. And there's also a theme that I was responsible for, as Viv mentioned, around stimulating investment around this sector. That interface into the private sector, that public-private partnership, I think is really, really important as part of just putting a different perspective on this. And I think there's an awful long way to go that we could start to explore further how those partnerships could work in other countries of the world. And I must have a shout out for Viv's role here. The line at the bottom there that says all of which require positive public support. Viv was absolutely instrumental in making sure in every discussion we had at Genomics England that was core to the approach across the whole business. So this is a simple summary of what was a hugely complex problem. But again, for me, for those who weren't involved in the detail, it just reinforces the point that this starts with the patient at the top. There's a relatively straightforward process that says you collect sample, you collect data, it goes to a sequencing house, it gets interpreted, there's a link to a diagnostic report that gets reported back to a clinician who feeds it back to a patient. Obviously, it's a hugely complex flow when you're trying to do that within a live system, but the interesting interface is that one into the blue and the red at the bottom there that says, actually, we don't know everything. It's not an automatic flow through on the green line there, on the green flow. What you have to have is an interface into the research academic agenda that on the back of the creation of the data archive, there is an enormous research agenda that helps to unlock the value in what we don't know currently, that when it's ready to be translated into a knowledge store, it can be integrated into the diagnostic report that ultimately will get fed back. And through being fed back, through monitoring what happens in the clinic, when you get unexpected responses, either a complete remission when you weren't expecting one or no response at all, that can inform future research. We can dive into the detail of why that may be the case. And for me, working at a whole systems level to understand what is hugely complex, but it can be simplified to this level, reinforces that point around convergence of the research and the clinical agenda to move something that in the past has taken 20 years, at least, to translate great thinking in a research base into something that's applied clinically, down to something in the order of 1 to 2 to 3 years, so that we can make a shorter term impact and have and make a difference for patients' lives more quickly. But it's not easy, and I touch on here just a number of the key challenges that we faced in making this a reality. And my role today is trying to take the learnings from the 100,000 Genomes project and work with many other countries around the world to address some of these issues and these challenges, which cannot be addressed without having multiple stakeholders at the same table to try and overcome some of these challenges. They address both the scientific, the clinical, the societal elements, but also the operational and technical. And in each country where you try and implement these kind of endeavors, the nuances will be different. Other countries don't want to do the 100,000 Genome Project, they want their version of it. And that's what makes this so fascinating, is that every different healthcare system will have its own approach, its own unique characteristics, its own requirements, its own demands, but all of them are possible. And the principle of accelerating the research to clinical agenda, that convergence theme, I think is relevant here too. The other point I'd like to make in closing is just this idea that if we can open up this platform, and if you like, I've shrunk down that version of what was Genomics England in a box, and I've said there were some key interfaces here that were absolutely critical to enable the project to be successful. And whether they were what we described as platform partners that were central to the Genomics England mission of enabling the creation of that data set that could be used at the clinical interface, whether it was the interface into pharma and biotech in the form of research partnerships that were driving future discoveries around new targets and new insights that could be gleaned from that aspect, through to the potential to recruit to trial through stratifying patients in the marketplace and directly being able to recruit those through clinical partnerships, and this whole endeavor around the front end. The creation of new companies on the back of this endeavor that didn't exist before, that with some help, maybe as spin-outs from academia, could also be integrated into the mix, so that platform that you create isn't one that was invented 5 years ago and stays static, but is one that is constantly replenished with new thinking, new innovation, new approaches, and this acceleration of that eternal loop between the two. And the other theme I'd like to really put out there is this idea of convergence around a core platform, with the idea that that can enable research, it can enable clinical, it could enable an accelerator fund. Each of those circles are traditionally seen as discrete and different. I believe the challenge that we're seeing in many countries of the world now is if you get the core platform right, it can accommodate all of those as part of one endeavor, with one thing feeding off the other constantly as part of that approach. And in terms of looking at a future perspective, the one thing I'd like to call out is the potential not just to do this at an individual country level, but there is now a phenomenal project that has the acronym MEGA, the Million European Genomes Alliance, that's looking at the principle of sharing and collaborating across countries. In this particular case, 18 countries in the EU that are looking to mobilize their efforts around their own genomic activity, and they look to be able to share that endeavor across those country boundaries to facilitate the acceleration of the interpretation piece that could then again have an impact for patients. So I think that's where it's going. There's this convergence theme, but actually there's an expansion of the thinking that comes from that, and then ultimately I think this will become a truly global play. So that's me, Viv. I will stop there.
I'm going to ask you to come and sit over here. Thank you very much. So we can take some questions with you and Tom in a moment. And thank you very much indeed.